Good evening and welcome to our October meeting of the Planning Policy Committee. Welcome to all of you that's taken the time and trouble to be with us this evening. Welcome to Councillor Yardley, who joined this committee as a substantive member for the first time. Welcome to you, and welcome to Andy Bailey of the Environment Agency, who will take us through the substantive item of business that we've got this evening. And additionally, welcome to Councillors Jones and Simpson, who are joining us on the screen. I did just send out an invitation to all, and Councillor Watson, likewise, who's taken the opportunity to come and be part of us this evening. I did send out a email to all members just to let them know that we have the 10 to 2100 presentation on today's agenda, just to give them the opportunity to hear it firsthand. So we'll crack on, and apologies for absence, please.
Thank you, Chairman. No apologies.
Thank you. And item 2, disclosures of interest. Seeing none, if anything comes up, wave at me at the time. Minutes of the meeting held 18th of September 2025. Are we all content?
Yeah,
We're quick out the trap tonight, Terry.
Sorry? Well, it just shows I'm still awake.
Thank you. I will sign those when I get a moment. Action from the previous meeting. We have anything, just a straightforward update from me that the paper we approved went through executive board, and that is now on its journey. That takes us on to item 5, and welcome, Andy. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and present on the FENS 2100. We're not hanging about here.
No, that's working. Thanks for the invite, everybody. So my name's Andy Bailey. I work at the Environment Agency on the FENS 2100 programme. I do have a bit of a background in planning, so sort of a bit familiar with what you're doing. I've worked on the FENS for a year. Previous to that, I was on the Humber 2100 project for 5 years as well, which I know that comes into East Lindsey, and I have a bit of a history with the Links Coast as well. So I know that the three span your area. The aim of today, from my perspective, is to sort of give you an overview of the FENS 2100 programme and the partnership and the work that we've done to date and what those next steps are. Obviously, you'll have heard about Links 2100, and you'll consider how this links to what I'm talking about today. I will share my presentation.
Oh, no.
That one. And then
Minimize that if you want.
yeah, okay. Technology. So I want to start really with a bit of history. The history of the FENS is fascinating, and it's really important context to help us understand what we're dealing with. I've got a couple of historic maps here. The left map sort of comes from the 11th century, and the right map, 1664. This is a starting point really to understand the FENS. It's an entirely man-made landscape, as I'm sure you're aware. Evolution of the FENS since 1400 sort of reflects a dramatic transformation from a vast marshy wilderness into one of mostly intensively managed agricultural landscapes within England. It's a low-lying region in East England, mainly below sea level rise, and as I say, historically marshland. Extensive drainage and land reclamation over the centuries, especially since the 17th century, have transformed the area into a fertile farmland that you see now. Much of the landscape lies below sea level, and it is one of the most engineered landscapes in the UK. It really stresses this is an entirely man-made landscape that we're in now. Landscape we see today shaped by those drainage systems, dikes and pumping stations. there's a timeline here. I'm not going to go into detail in it. This will all be available at a later date, but say when you look at the history of the fens, it is really fascinating. There's been significant investment in this landscape, a legacy over generations. We go back to the Dutch in the 17th century, we're looking at about 16 generations. And before that, there's been significant investment in here. There's, if you go by today's money, billions of pounds there. But some key points, major drainage works really began in earnest in the 17th century, led by the Fens adventurers and the Dutch engineers like Vermeulen. And the landscape you see today still reflects their vision. And the 17th century drainage schemes which transformed the region into this flat fertile farmland we see now. To support that, it took major acts of parliament. It took many, many years and lots of social unrest as well. But all of that was needed to make it all happen. So 17th century significant investment at that time. Then really want to just come forward to the post-war period where food security was a big issue. So significant investment in the 50s through that. And then also the 1953 coastal flood, which we know significantly hit East Lindsey. So significant investment in the 60s, largely around food. Many of those assets are still in place today and they continue to serve their purpose today as well. But that's 65 years ago. So many of those assets are aging. Today, this region, the Fens, relies on constant water management to remain habitable and productive. It's one of the few landscapes where our flood risk and water management assets, they're not passive, they are used 24/7 hours, 24/7, 365 days a year. It's important to note that the time, effort, that blood, sweat and tears that went into creating the Fens and that investment, it's left a legacy of critically important and a valuable landscape that adds significantly to UK GDP. These are some of the stats we've come up. I'm not going to go through them all, but just some to highlight. About 450,000 square hectares. This is a big area. It covers a lot of Lincolnshire, a lot of Cambridgeshire, and we are focusing on the Fens, so which is largely Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire Fens, but does incorporate Norfolk and a little bit of Suffolk as well. It's largely agriculture. 96.5% of the area is that. 50% of the country's grade 1 agriculture is within the Fens, and it's about 90% of the Fens is grade 1 and grade 2, so our best agricultural land. That makes it very rural, which brings its own challenges. There are about 3,000 miles of watercourses and embankments, 318 pumping stations, various weirs, tidal gates, barriers, networks of drains and ditches. That's 17,000 assets in total. About 400,000 people live in areas at risk of flooding, but there's about 750,000 people in total, and they're all either directly or indirectly impacted by flooding. These maps are to demonstrate the criticality, the critical nature of the flood risk and water management assets that we have. So the map on the left demonstrates where the tide would come to if there were no coastal defences. That's mean high water springs. So the high tides twice a month would come in that far, you would then recede, but there's a bowl there, so it would gather. That's demonstrating the critical nature of those coastal assets. The area, as I say, can't get away from fundamentally it's a landscape below sea level, therefore at risk of flooding from whether it be the sea or fluvial. And also you've got rainfall within there. This being a peak landscape, over the centuries, the land has been lowering with oxidisation of the peat and the farming. So land is going down, we have subsidence, and we have sea level rise going on as well. So without that active management, large areas would revert to wetland and becoming uninhabitable. The map on the right shows that even with the physical embankments and defences in place, if the pumping station network, those 318 pumps, were to stop working, this is what large areas of the Fens become underwater within 5 to 10 years. Pumps stop working, the other assets struggle as well. So These are hypothetical maps to show the critical nature of our assets. The operation of those 24/7, they support life, the economy across the fens. And it's really important that we try to get across the importance of those assets and the system. Timeline on the left, and we don't need to look in detail, but that shows significant floods which have occurred across the fens. So between 1947 and 1998, there were 3. There's been 7 since 2000, and 5 of those are within the last 6 years. So these flood events are happening more frequently. We can see that across Lincolnshire. We're having to deal with it more and more often, and we have the impacts of sea level rise and our assets on those. This is a schematic that we've had done across the fens, which shows the complexity of the system that we're operating here. We're looking at about 17,000 individual flood risk assets, but they don't operate in isolation. It's important the fens operate as a system. We have 5 catchments within there which sort of operate separately, but fens operate as a system. What we do on one asset can have an impact on another. So we need to look at those collection of assets to understand how we might manage risk within here. So 17,000 assets include pumping stations, which move water out of the low-lying areas. Those embankments, those highland water carriers to protect against river and coastal flooding. They're carrying the water from the highland areas out towards the sea. And those drainage channels and sluices to regulate water levels to keep our properties dry and to keep the land productive as well. They work together as a system and require ongoing maintenance, investment and modernisation to remain effective. And as you've seen from the previous maps, any failure or underperformance of these systems could lead to rapid and widespread flooding. The challenge we face, we try to keep it simple, but we see there's 2 key challenges which we're facing across the fens. There's a placekeeping challenge. This is how can we sustain and maintain that complex but critical system that protects the fens? It's aging and increasingly fragile. And the evidence tells us that the infrastructure that protects fens, as I say, is aging, fragile, and many of those assets were built in the 60s primarily to manage the land for food production, and they're going to need significant investment to maintain them now and into the long term. Specifically, some of those embankments were built over a century ago and they are deteriorating, weren't built to modern engineering standards. There's 2,800 miles of those embankments. So significant investment needed there. Pumping stations are operating beyond their design life. So significant investment there. We're doing a very good job between ourselves and the IDBs at maintaining them, keeping them operating and sustaining the systems we are. But we can't get away from the need for investment going forward. Changing weather patterns are accelerating these risks with sea level rise, more intense rainfall, prolonged droughts. They're putting unprecedented pressure on the system. As sea levels rise, we need gravity-fed systems. We're losing them. We're having to use more and more pumping, which puts more and more pressure on those systems themselves. So then we have a place-making challenge, which is more the space of local authorities like yourselves. So we're going to need to have a wider conversation about what the future of the fens landscape is. What do we, UK PLC, want from the fens? Historically, food has been really important, is really important, but there are conflicting pressures on there. Housing growth, energy production, and food security. There's lots which can be delivered from this landscape. We need to determine what it is want from that, and that's really important because there's a lot of value in this landscape. How do we manage that through flood risk? We need to know what we want to do, but that is more the job of the local authorities. It is likely that in the future, that job of water level management, flood risk management, will become more technically and economically challenged to sustain the assets that we have, given those challenges that I've outlined. Therefore, we face a future where the old ways of protecting the land may not be enough, but we're not powerless in that. Every generation has responded to the unique social and economic and environmental challenges across the fens. Really is a fascinating landscape which you've seen communities adapt, society adapt, and we need to continue to do that. These challenges are here for us as our generation to prepare for those coming forward. So similar to the conversations that are occurring on the Lincolnshire coast, there's a need to understand the role that we want the fens to play in the future. So in the next few years, 5-10 years, there's going to be a need to make strategic decisions on the future of the landscape. And there will need to be decisions made on how we want this landscape to respond to the current ambitions, including growth and food security. We need to face those challenges head on and turn them into opportunities. And that will help us clarify the future flood risk management decisions which we need to make. Lincolnshire County Council, East Lindsey, or the local authorities will have a key role in these conversations. It's not about quick fixes. At the moment, it's about laying those strong foundations so our communities and environment can thrive for future. We are in a partnership at Fens 2100 because we realise no one organisation can solve this issue. The Environment Agency as flood risk management asset infrastructure providers and risk management authorities have a specific role. Local authorities do and other organisations do. So our role in the short term is around sustaining this system while some of those longer term decisions are made, and then we can collectively start to decide what those next steps are around flood risk management and looking to make that case for investment in that in this very valuable landscape. Fens 2100 partnership came around because we recognise the challenges across these landscape, and we are in the fortunate position of being the only landscape that's specifically mentioned within the National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy and a specific measure put within there. Fens is special. So there's a specific measure in there. The partnership was pulled together to deliver that, and that measure is about working with relevant organisations to develop a long-term plan managing future flood risk in the fens. Been on that for 2 years. We're coming up to a critical stage, which I'll come back to, but that's what we're here talking about today. We've gathered a lot of evidence. So those partnerships, the partnership includes Lincolnshire County Council, Norfolk and Cambridgeshire as counties. There's a little bit of Suffolk in there as well, so we need to do a bit more. The one combined authority that was in existence at the time, and we'll be looking to bring Greater Lincolnshire into the fold. The 2 RSCCs are there. We've got ADA, we've got representation from the Internal Drainage Board, but across this landscape there's something like 65 IDBs, so there's appropriate representation at ADA there. National Farming Union, it's a critical area for farming, Natural England and Angling Water as risk management authorities, but also recognising the critical role that they play in providing water resources and the links to that. Environment Agency and evidence-led organisation. It's really important, and we would rightly scrutinise and say, what evidence do you have? It's collected a lot of evidence over the last 2 years, lots of it. This has been being put to good use to get to where we are now. I'm not going to go through a lot of it, but some key pieces of evidence: asset condition and vulnerability has been really important. But it's not just about being in an office, it's about understanding how this landscape works. So the lived experience, speaking to people who lived and breathed the fens, people who have operated the way this landscape works for generations. Understanding their experience is really valuable, and learning from international experience, the likes of the Dutch as well, who operate a different system, but there are things that we can learn from them. That evidence has led us to a starting premise, and it's easy with some of the stuff which we can talk about in the evidence we've seen to see the negatives, the risks which are involved here. But we want to be clear that whilst the evidence highlights those significant issues and challenges, We've come to this starting premise, which we see as non-negotiable. Firstly, fens is a valuable landscape, as I've outlined, both nationally and regionally, and it needs to be protected. We're not asking the question of whether the fence should be there or not. It needs to be, although that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be as it currently is. The fens is a valuable place and will continue to be so. We know it's evolved and adapt throughout history. It needs to evolve and adapt going forward. As I've already mentioned, fens can only operate because of the critical infrastructure that underpins it. So one of the key aims is to get people to understand and recognise that link. So why I keep saying this is critical infrastructure, but it is getting harder to sustain that system. Therefore, there's a need to act now. We're in a partnership because we realise no one organisation can solve the issue. It's not just down to the EA to make those placemaker decisions. However, as flood risk managers and placemakers, whatever the solution, the environment will be a key player in ensuring that that vision comes to fruition. Do we need more money? Yes, we do, but it's not just about that. It's not about getting additional funding. It's about how we use that funding efficiently and create the best outcomes across the system. There's been a lowland system. The funding system that we have doesn't necessarily work for us all the time. So we're looking at how can we change that to make it work for the fens and making that case. And then we have the strap line, pretty much that. If we're successful in getting this, then we'll get the right money, the right time, the right places, and the right things in the hands of the right people. And that's how we'll achieve our mission of a vibrant and climate resilient fens. There are important, significant, difficult decisions to be made in the future. No decision is a decision in itself, but the alternative to not doing this is failure for our communities. So to achieve that, we've got three sort of key work streams which are making up the FENS 2100 programme. We've got catchment baseline reports. We're developing 5 catchments. I'll show you the catchments shortly. And they provide an overview of each of those catchments. The reports will give an insight into how flood risk management assets currently operate. They will also provide information on the current and future flood risk of each catchment. I think there will be important evidence basis for yourselves as a planning committee and in developing the local plan. Then we have a case for change document. We're currently working on this, and it's about transforming our approach to investing in flood and coastal resilience, getting the right investment we need to make this the vibrant climate resilient fens. We know there needs to be changes. That report and the associated action plan is the first of its kind, and it sets out our first response to that measure to the National Flood Risk Strategy, like developing a long-term plan. And then we're currently scoping a decade of action. We're sort of leading into this, and that will lead to the production of catchment-led asset investment strategies. Our assets operate as a system. We need to do things differently. What do we need to do within each of these catchments to sustain over the next 10 or so years? What level of investment is needed? And that's not necessarily about new assets. It's about how we change the way funding works so that we can maintain these. We've inherited a huge amount of assets which have been invested in over centuries. They are really important. How do we make those work? Not necessarily replacing. Some of them do need replacing. So getting that in place and giving some clarity on that medium-term asset investment priorities, and importantly working on the what next. You'll have heard from Lincolnshire Coast and probably Humber that we were all 2100 projects, but actually 2040 is a critical date. We have aging assets, and in 2040, other assets will come to the end of their design life, and increasing weather patterns and so on. 2040 is a key date for all 3 of those projects. We will need to be making decisions around what follows 2040 and starting to plan for the investment that happens there. The next 10 years, this decade of action, is around sustaining the system that we currently have, seeking the investment to do that, and having those discussions, those place-making discussions about what we want for the landscape and starting to plan what's next for flood risk management and water management there. Those baseline reports and case for change are currently being finalised and being endorsed by our partnership. They will be published winter 26, I would say now. That marks a major milestone for the partnership. So they set out the issues and challenges, they make a case for change, but importantly, we and partners are not just making a case for change, we're driving that change. So it includes a partnership action plan, which is designed to begin that decade of action. I'm not going to go through, it's not the time to go through the actions, but East Lindsey as placemakers will need to be involved with some of them. We're working on what that is at the moment. I was talking to Greg in the local plans team yesterday around some of that. So next steps for the programme, February, March time, looking at launching and publishing these documents. That's the case for change makes that case for change, starts looking at why we need the investment, how do we go about doing it, but it's our case to government, to wider politicians. So around that time, that's when we start taking this to ministers and to MPs. So we'll be looking at big launch events and that delivery of action plans, and then working with yourselves. Across the Fens, we currently have 15 local planning authorities. We need to work together. I know you work with Boston and South Holland, but how do we work collectively across the Fens on what do we want from this landscape? What does this mean for future development? And flood risk management, water management, those, as I said, those assets are critical to life currently within the Fens, but they're critical to growth as well. They underpin it and they can be an enabler of growth. I think we need to understand how growth can be a supporter of those critical assets and infrastructure as it is elsewhere. So there's some very big challenges. We're working at what that is, and the plans are to broaden it out and bring local planning authorities and our upper tier and combined authorities, all those levels of government together in the spring, sort of April, May time at the moment, bring you all with more, but we're happy to have some discussions before on that as well. I will leave it there and questions, I suppose.
Thank you very much indeed for that. I mean, just from me, it is really good to see the scale of ambition that's behind these proposals, and also the tangible sense of urgency that's underpinning a lot of this. But I shall open it up for comments and questions from the committee. Who would like to go first? Councillor McNally.
Go on, thank you, and apologies for being late. I think there's a harsh reality that you can have the Environment Agency, all these district councils, council, everything working together, but if you don't get that money from government, you're peeing in the wind. And in say 5 or 10 years' time, you're going to have to tell people which land is going to have to let go, or which houses or villages is going to have to let go. And that will be the point, that the only point then that people start listening in government. But until you start, you know, there's a lot of, and I don't mean to be rude, there's a lot of environmental acronyms in your speech, you know, placemaking. Your average person in the street doesn't know what that means.
No.
So I think there needs to be a bit of truth being told, you know, that we haven't got the money. It's, you know, working in collaboration is just a bit wishy-washy words, really.
The case for change, the baselines and the case for change put greater figures on the investment which is required, and it's clear that we do not have that money, and we are making the case that we need that investment and the value that it is underpinning. But alongside that, there is that placemaking, which is a role which should be understood here and take on board that local communities don't do that. We need to ensure when we do talk to communities, we speak the right language. but determining what we want from this landscape, and how we do that. And that may be the discussions around where water might go. But we're not at that stage yet. That's something which will come forward. It's a recommendation within the case for change. What do we want from this landscape, and how do we manage that going forward? What are the landscape choices to support what yourselves, what other local planners, what government want from this landscape, but we're being clear what the risks are and what some of the costs are involved, and what needs to change within the system for us to be able to sustain the system that we currently have, whilst we look at what some of those longer term changes might be. And there will be significant changes to the way we manage. So examples which could be given there are, we hold the tide on the Nene at the Dog and the Double in Peterborough. Is that where we want to hold it in the coming years? What are the benefits of moving it to somewhere different? That would change the landscape. It could bring huge opportunities with it. I'm not saying that is the answer, but the scale of some of those. What do we do along the coast? We need to doing further work over the next 2 years to align what we are doing with the shoreline management plans, because the two do need to work together. But there will be big decisions that need to be made there. We're saying we need to make those decisions in the short term because they take time to plan. We do, but I do not disagree that there is a big scale of investment here, and we need to talk to government about what that is, and then what we can realistically deliver.
Yeah, because I mean, you know, as a guess, you're probably talking £1 to £2 billion.
We're talking billion.
Yeah,
not
exactly.
millions.
And the whole national flood budget is 2.6 billion for 2 years. So there's a reality that it ain't going to happen.
There is a reality that there is a mismatch between the two. Yeah, we need to have that conversation with government as a partnership as to what is required, and the benefits that brings. But yeah, I don't dispute that there is a mismatch there, and there is a hell of a challenge. But as a partnership, we are up for that, and we're taking this to government.
I think it's interesting when you talk in terms of the billions which we assume will be needed across the Fenland landscape to keep it protected. But I think there is a compelling argument to be made, and I fully accept, I think that needs to be made at the Cabinet Office end of government, the people that are making the long-term decisions and looking at those longer-term horizons. I'd hope longer-term horizons than the Treasury ever does. But there is an immense value of homes, of businesses and farmland, which I think comes to many more billions across that Fenland landscape of of Lincolnshire, of Cambridgeshire, of those bits of Suffolk. And an argument that I am always keen to make, we've also got the value of the assets that are already there, the drains, the embankments, the pumping stations, the sluices. Some of them are rightly going to need refurbishment, and it's just interesting. We talk of 2040 being a critical epoch. In 2040, the diesel engines in Laidbank pumping station will be 100 years old. But we've already got much of the structure, much of that infrastructure, and that has a value, because to my mind, we're not having to spend equivalent billions draining the fens. Our ancestors have already done that. It's a case of reinforcing, rebuilding where necessary, and upgrading and extending the life of those assets, and doing some things differently with them. But I think it's a compelling argument to take to government, not just the value of what these assets are protecting, but the value of those assets in themselves. Because if you were to try and calculate what it would cost to dig the channels, to straighten the rivers, to put those infrastructures in, it will come to a lot more, I think, than what we're likely to be asking the government for to keep it in place. Hang on, I've got Councillor McNally, then Councillor Dawson. And then we'll come to Councillor Simpson.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I just think it's quite important to there's got to be a reality check and there's got to be an honesty check. I mean, I visited Fairburn in Wales, and that was one of the places that is no longer being defended. And there's for sale signs everywhere. No one can get mortgages, no one can get insurance, and that will happen. You know, you can't deny it. It will happen, but probably people need to know roughly where it's going to happen. And the sooner people are told this, it's the harsh line, because as soon as you say it, you've got blight. But it does need to be done.
That's what we're trying to avoid at the moment. We are not giving up on this landscape. We're taking the evidence we've got to government as a partnership to do that. So we are fighting for this. We're putting about Tom's point about that inherent value in the assets that we've got. We're pulling that together. There is a lot going for it. The fence is very valuable, and we're all passionate about taking this. We're not giving up on it. We're not, but there may be places where that needs to happen. Nobody can say where that is at the moment. Yeah. We're fighting for that not to happen.
I think it's also quite a lot easier for government to abandon an individual settlement. It is a lot harder to abandon a landscape. Councillor Dawson.
Thank you, Chair. A simple question, but probably not easily answered. What do we know about the last time that central government was, to use the phrase that was mentioned just now, challenged about this? What conversations are going on between our levels of government and the partnership that you referred to and the central government, either at the officer level or civil servant or at a political level? I mean, as Tom just said, these things are going to have to be dealt with at that national government level, at cabinet level. Someday, some fine day, it'll be on the agenda of the cabinet. So what do we know about what's gone on to this point in terms of a communication, a challenge to national government? What is the national government's response? Or have we not actually asked for any responses historically in the last few years? I don't know.
Not an easy question. So the way I'll try to respond to that, so the case for change is we're making a case to do things differently. The way flood risk management funding has worked in recent years is we've focused on asset by asset. And that's the way the funding system has worked. It doesn't work in these lowland areas where our assets operate together as a system. We will be pulling together a 10-year costed programme of what we need to do across the fens to sustain this system, and then building a business case for investment in the fens. The way it's worked to date is what's the business case for in this asset here and that asset there? It's been disjointed. We need to do this as a system. So we haven't gone to government with, we need X billion, but that we've not been in that position. We are getting to that position.
I made just a quick follow-up, but thank you, Chair. Understand that, that's reasonable, clearly. But is there any connection between this partnership that's working on this program, which has a long-term perspective, and the national government itself? For example, should there be somebody from central government attached to the partnership deliberations? I mean, I see the Environment Agency is there, but it's a technical function in my mind. Shouldn't there be some ongoing contact? Shouldn't we be asking and getting some kind of early indication what national government's attitude is? I mean, wouldn't that be helpful if we knew that, you know, as Councillor McNally said, if there's nothing going to be at the end of the rainbow, wouldn't it be useful to have some communication going on about that we could get a clue, and that would actually put an important perspective for what you're doing as a partnership, or because, you know, you will do more or less in certain areas and I'm not in certain areas, less in other areas. So if there was some, it seems to me strange that the partnership of all these authorities is working away with it really what sounds like blind to what national governments, and I say that because we're looking at the long term, so governments will change, I realize that. But surely there should be some communication going on with central government, people at central government at some level, civil servants at least.
So that is the next stage. The Fence 2100 was established under the national strategy, which is signed off by DEFRA. So you've got that communication. We've been collecting the evidence around this because we have to have that to go to government. When we launch these products, which will be this winter, there is the plan is being developed. How do we engage with our MP, our local MPs, our ministers across government? This requires a cross-government response, but we have to go to them with evidence in a planned way. So I agree with you, that needs to happen. That's where we're getting to, and that will be happening in the coming months.
Just for a little bit of background, this isn't something that the Environment Agency or DEFRA or government has just decided is an issue. This has been in gestation for quite some time, and FEN 2100 has been up and running for over 2 years now. Am I right in thinking? Yeah. Councillor Simpson, online, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The business of LGR, is that going to compromise your work and the sourcing of money and the obviously a change possibly in the partnership authorities that will be having to work with you? And I'd be interested in what sort of engagement you have had with ministers and in the process of LGR and how it's going to affect your plans and the delivery of those plans and the sourcing of funding. There's also the business of the, from my understanding, that the mayor, talking about Lincolnshire here in particular, but the mayor will have the power to direct, there's that potential to direct where development is going to go in terms of transport infrastructure and housing. And it may well be that the mayor, with advice, may well prefer to concentrate housing development away from the coast, and therefore there might be not as much importance given to sustaining the well-being of the flood risk areas. You know, we could be compromised on that point. So I'd be interested to know whether this LGR is actually going to be somewhat of a setback for you.
I'll come in first from a kind of spatial planning perspective. So planning legislation is changing. We're expecting a new MPPF in a relative short order with a whole variety of different things. But the one thing to mention in response to the points made there by Councillor Simpson is that the mayoral authorities will have a responsibility for a spatial development strategy, which is essentially old school spatial planning, strategic planning, what was back before 2010 a regional spatial strategy, and before that, before 2004, was a county structure plan. So the point that's been made is a fair one there. There will be a role for combined authorities to produce spatial plans. We do await some guidance on what that exactly looks like. The legislation hasn't been enacted yet. That looks to be probably into 2026. But nevertheless, yes, so high level infrastructure planning, broad locations for growth, all of that kind of ilk, that will be a role for the mayoral authority. And local plans, whether they be in continuing districts or unitaries in due course, will have to be prepared in accordance with them. But the starting point still is every single district does have their own housing target as laid down by the standard methodology. And we know East Lindsey's went up by a significant amount earlier in the year. But so I think there's a lot of unknowns is the honest answer in terms of where we are with spatial planning and strategic planning, other than to say that it's coming back. And the questions on the funding, I don't know whether Andy's in a better position on that.
I would first on local government reorganisation. I think it brings us opportunities. I've been around long enough to see several reorganisations happen. We have to continue going while that happens. The issues will still remain the same. Working on a spatial development strategy at a more strategic level at this stage, I think brings us the opportunity to get FENS 2100 and those issues recognised at that level. The good local government reorganisation and new local plans, if that goes to timetable around 2028, we're in a better position working together across the current 15 local planning authorities, however many we may have at that stage, and we've worked together and we've recognised the issues. We're in a better place to plan that development going forward. Regarding funding, local government, local authorities are one part of the potential funding opportunity. We'll be working to put a funding and financing strategy because we recognise the scale of investment that's needed is bigger than the granting aid pot, as has already been alluded to, and we need to find different ways to fund what will be required. We need to do things differently. We need to change the way the system works. So local government will be very important in that, but so will others, and local reorganisation continue to happen. We have to continue to work with the landscape we're given.
Can I just come back on that? I mean, can I just add to that? Is obviously with these changes, these proposed with LGR, which is not only going to affect Lincolnshire but going further south as well. The business of the funding for drainage boards, which are quite critical to your partnership, working with the drainage boards, which you need each other, but they rely on this circuit of funding that goes to local authorities through yourselves and back to them, and then the levy that they put on landowners, etc., the circle, and that local authorities being very concerned to distance themselves from the funding of drainage boards. Is that a potential setback as well for your plans with
funding? Funding is a challenge. Funding is a challenge for the IDBs, it's a challenge for the Environment Agency, and the scale of investment needed will be a challenge. We will be needing to look at that and talk to government about how those funding and financing models work and how they may work for the FENS going forward. And we need to consider that with the bigger landscape choices which will be needed post 2040s and how we do that. The challenge is significant. We need to look at how we do things differently. The challenges around current drainage and how IDBs are funded and the legislations around them are there. We have ADA around the table and the IDBs. They are talking to ministers separately around that, but we are joined up. Again, there are no magic bullets here, but we recognise those challenges.
Right. Thank you, sir.
Maybe I can perhaps add one or two little bits around the edges of that. I think local government reorganisation does in itself offer the opportunity to have one local planning authority looking after the Lincolnshire part of the FEN, whereas at the moment there are 5 local planning authorities. Boston and South Holland obviously are deeply in the FENs, and North and South Kesteven and East Lindsey, we've all got a relatively small part of our district in the FEN. So, perhaps having one local planning authority to deal with instead of 5 might be an improvement. On IDB funding, it's probably a little bit off topic, but just since you mentioned it, Daniel, the way I'd look at it is once there are unitary authorities, then IDB precepts will be a much smaller part of our overall revenue budgets than they are for district councils. And there is a danger that the government will look at that and think we've solved the problem by effectively moving it to a bigger council so that it doesn't feel quite so apparent. That may be an opportunity the government is looking for to end the support that is given to East Lindsey and others to meet some of our special levy costs. There is also a danger two IDBs of having effectively all of those IDBs in southern Lincolnshire represented by the same council. At the moment, every IDB has a mix of councillors from, in our experience, East Lindsey and at least one other council. And it makes it very, very difficult to browbeat your councillors into setting an unsafe budget for a drainage board if they're coming from different councils. But if they're coming from one council, then it is a danger, and it is something that's recognised by Ada and our boards, that there are councils out there that use their strong arm tactics when it comes to setting drainage board budgets so as to protect their own council budget, which is not how the system is supposed to work, but it does in one or two cases. So we wouldn't want to see that happening in Lincolnshire, but fundamentally the figures that we're talking about for FEN 2100 are at a much more strategic level than necessarily the tactical year-to-year funding of boards. Neil, Councillor Jones, please.
Yeah, Tom, you've just answered a part of my question, because as you realise, we spend over half our rates on drainage boards, so the money's got to come from somewhere else. But it does concern me that we can't, we talk about partnership, and with the Wrangle Bank, the EA wouldn't even let us take silt out of the wash. We had to destroy 150 acres of farmland to build a bank. And I can't see how you're going to get some of these organisations to agree together when we can't even do a simple task like that.
If I can just put that into a little bit of context, I think that was actually Natural England that wouldn't let us put a bucket in the wash because it's all of its designations. But I suppose what the crux in the context of what you said a few moments ago with the River Nene, how would you ever move the sluice gates and the tidal range of the River Nene without coming up against an awful lot of bug watchers and an awful lot of scientific designations?
We would come across them, but we'd need to work. We're not saying that is a solution, but they will be on the table. We would have to work. How do you do that?
Anybody else? Go for it.
Thank you for your indulgence. It's a very interesting presentation. I'm pleased I came. There is I appreciate the urgency which is obviously taking place with FENS 2100, and I believe that Humber 2100 is also fairly advanced. Whereabouts is Lincolnshire or Links 2100? I can fully appreciate that FENS is a very valuable asset, very valuable landscape in many ways. If I'm right in thinking that the FENS 2100 planning is going ahead and Links 2100 is not at that level, it's further back if it even exists, I hear very little about it. Is that a reflection of the value of the land protected by the coast? The moment we're holding the line in Lincolnshire, does that indicate that there will be, that the Environment Agency thinks there will be possibly managed retreat along our coastline, which is of main concern to us?
I would say the Links Coast 2100 project is a bit ahead of the FENS 2100 project. And I thought Deb Higdon had been.
Just on experience, I think Links 2100 is probably about a year behind FENS. But Humber is, but at the same time, it feels like FENS has gone a long way in a short time, whereas the other one being Humber has been rattling around for years.
But Links 2100 has a business case in for that short term. It's a significant amount of money, £300 million plus, to see through to 2040, and a partnership just been established and led now by Lincolnshire County Council to determine what happens post 2040.
Thank you. I'm sure, Chairman, that we've had a presentation from the Links. Yeah, I think he was here actually.
I didn't specifically about the plans, it was about the state of the defences and so on. I remember the presentation indeed, yeah. Fair enough, I'm delighted to hear that Links 2100 is not far behind, if not.
I think the interesting contrast is we have deteriorating and aging assets in the fens, but I think the risk of a catastrophic failure is substantial, is a different order of magnitude to the sea defences that we have on the coast. And it's interesting when you look at those maps, there isn't a hard line on the map that says here is fens and here is coast. If it comes in up the coast, it's going to come round into the fen. Who else have we got? Councillor Yardley.
Andy, thank you very much for that presentation. I knew nothing about this, so I'm very grateful for being here. I just want to play the devil's advocate for a second, because I spoke to one of my residents the other day and I said, we spend a lot of money in IDBs, blah, blah, blah. And she just looked at me and said, well, we should stop paying money to them. And I said, well, we can't do that because we'll lose the coast. She said, well, we should lose the coast then, because that's money we could use somewhere else. And while I heard that argument and I went, oh, it's not that simple, I understand why that argument was made, because it's a large chunk of money that we're essentially putting in sand for it to get washed back out into the ocean and then bringing it back in. And that's just one aspect of it. I understand that. With regards to the fence, right? Current government, and everybody here at the planning table understands this, where I'm going to come from. We're required to have 150% increase in our housing target. None of us agree with it, but that's what we've been told. Where are we going to put this? So we have the walls, we have no place to put it there. We have the coast, which is constantly bridging back into the ocean, which we are spending money on. Now we have the fens, which is bringing water back up. And we're trying to get, I think you said 370 pumps basically up to scratch and get them working properly. How does one make a case to central government to say, you guys need to empty your pockets a bit and get on board with this? And also, what is the buy-in for other councils? And I'm sure you guys have had some private conversations in the background with central government, as you know, Councillor Dawson just said, you know, is there a conversation with the government? Is there somebody, like the IDBs all have a single councillor represented, and that councillor will fight their cause for them? Is there somebody from central government who is fighting this cause with regards to the fens or, you know, the internal drainage boards? I understand that was a lot, but.
I'll cover a little bit after start. I think there is an inherent tension, evidently, between these increased housing numbers and the delivery of infrastructure, not just in this part of the world, but nationally, evidently. As kind of alluded to before when I spoke in response to Councillor Simpson, clearly also the government sees a key role for combined authorities in that planning at a spatial level in terms of strategic planning. So that, to me, in my mind, is where that does become the vehicle for those conversations about investment in infrastructure, and then delivery is done locally through the local plans. But that is still emerging legislation, emerging policy, and clearly in Lincolnshire the combined authority is very new. So so there's a lot going on, and there perhaps aren't those simple answers, but I share the concern you've raised, which is where is that link between how do we deliver these houses and where's the infrastructure? It was ever thus.
So what was the question for me?
Was a long ass ramble is basically what it was, and not understanding how we could fix this. Also, how is this something that we've only just started focusing on? Because clearly, based on the timeline, you've said, you know, this is way, I think I saw a number there, one of the years was BC, 1000 something BC or something like that. So this is not new. So we've been talking about, or have this at the back of our mind, that we need to do something about this. How is it that the FEN 2100s only just started? Or has there been other programs in the past that have sort of been, or is this just sort of off channel, one or two people talking about it?
So the Fence 2100 has been going for 2 years, which is a relatively short amount of time. We've done a lot of work in those 2 years. It came about because of some work we did on the Great Ouse catchment down in Cambridgeshire Way, which highlighted some of the significant issues there, and then a recognition that actually it's a part of the fence. So we do need to take this landscape scale approach, recognised within the national strategy. We were given £10 million through that to develop a long-term plan managing flood risk. Over those 2 years, we've collected the evidence. We're pulling that together, and we'll be going to government with this case for change, with why we need to invest in this valuable landscape, what we need to invest in, and how we do that. and starting the conversations around what needs to change, what do people want from this landscape. So those conversations with government, they will be happening. We have been providing briefing notes at times because don't we get things from ministers around food security, so they're aware of the work we're doing on the fence, but we need to get that evidence together properly to get their ear and pull them together. And we plan, when we publish in February, that's what we're working on doing, bringing them together. And again, it's about bringing them together across parties, across departments. This is not a DEFRA issue, it's wider. It is.
The great contrast, I think, that's relevant between what we're looking at here and what has happened, apart from the initial work to do that drainage, the initial adventure of the investment that went into to doing that drainage work, what has happened invariably across most of that timeline is that improvements have come after a major event. So usually it took a devastating catastrophe for the new channel to be built or the new sluice to be built, because the last one was blown out by the pressure of the water, the tides. If any of you have the opportunity to go down to Denver and just look at the sluice gates, the complex there, and if you look at evolving maps of the fens, then effectively what our ancestors have done every few decades is dig a new channel to try and get water to the sea faster. And I say quite often those have come after the previous channel has been proven to be deficient and caused quite a spectacular flood. So it's really reassuring that we're talking about this now rather than waiting for 2100 to get here and either Denver to fall over or pumping station to fail or sluice gates to fail and then have the major crisis of what are we going to do. At least we're able to plan ahead here. I've got Councillor Simpson, then I'll come back to you. Councillor Simpson.
Can I just, and I think you might agree with this, Councillor Ashton, it's a myth to say that the drainage boards are a part of the council's budget. The councils are collecting agencies for the drainage board, and it's been a little bit of a misleading to say that they're a cost to the council. Council is a collecting agency for drainage boards in the same way as they are for the police authority and the county council.
I'm afraid not, Councillor Simpson. If it was, our problem would be a lot simpler. We haven't been simply a collecting agency for the drainage board since the introduction of council tax replaced the old rate system. Originally, we did indeed collect drainage rates, and they are levied on domestic property within a drainage district, and hand those rates over to the relevant drainage board. Since the introduction of council tax, then that levy from IDB, which is still calculated on the rateable value of the properties which are in drainage districts, has been rendered as a charge on the lower tier authority. So it is a bill that comes to East Lindsey, which we have to pay out of our general budget. So while it is calculated on a relatively small proportion of the properties in East Lindsey, it is then through our budget, through council tax, charged on all of them. So anyone sitting in the Wold is paying about half of their council tax into East Lindsey's budget, which is going straight out again in special levy. So we originally collected it on behalf of boards. We still, I suppose, in theory, do collect it, but we don't collect it exclusively from the properties on which it is levied.
I
Councillor
stand corrected on that.
Two questions. One, in this proposal of yours, do you guys consider, your pumps, you mentioned they were diesel. Is there any new technology that you could replace the mechanism of this pumping, which could be better or smarter or more efficient? One, and second, I have forgotten my question, but we'll go with the one.
I believe I mentioned they were diesel, but you're quite correct. A lot of them are. Some have been Tom will probably know more than me, but some have been electrified. So They are in need, many of them, not necessarily all, but many of them are in need of upgrading. It may be that actually some of them should be decommissioned, and you have new pumping stations which serve better purpose for more, taking out more of the pumping stations. One of the things which we'd like to do is rationalise systems so there's less assets for us to manage. So it may be better to have a bigger, better new one which is electric, but we're not considering that on a case by case basis at the moment. And many of those will come down to the IDBs to do, but they have significant challenges around how they operate diesel or electric, and the electric ones bringing their own problems because of costs. Yeah, there's no simple solution to that.
If ever you have the opportunity, I say this to anyone that's interested, next time there's a significant rainfall event, go park your car up down Lade Bank, down Hobole Bank, near Lade Bank pumping station in Old Leek, and listen to the engine. It's the most wonderful noise. Did you think you had one more point?
I was just going to actually make a point to something you had said earlier, which was about, we tend to, the sense I get is we tend to be reactive to situations instead of proactive. I respect the fact that the 2100 is a proactive plan or is meant to be, but I find it bizarre that we're constantly, there's a rainfall now. Well, we tend to know these things beforehand. We need to, and I think one of the small things, again, I don't know if this falls within your purview, is the drains. Is cleaning of these drains important within this the FEN 2100? If there were clearer drains, would that help your cause as opposed to just the big pumping station? I understand it's a large quantity of water we're talking about.
Coming down to that level of detail around which drains might need to be cleared, we're not looking at that as a project. That comes down to the smaller detail and what needs to be done where, and that might be an appropriate approach in some places, not everywhere. It might not be. And there was another question there, but I've forgotten it. But I had an answer. Yes, I had an answer to it, but
I think it's clear, isn't it, that we need a scale of ambition and investment to match the scale and ambition of the investment of our ancestors that created this landscape. And I think it's important to recognise that we are dealing with one of the most productive agricultural districts in Europe that is almost entirely artificially created. But that is a substantial and significant value attached to all of that, not just in farmland, but also in if you think of every business, if you think across to the south of East Lindsey and south, you've got Boston, you've got Spalding and the food processing industries. If you think of you take everything which is in the Fens, I think it makes a very compelling case for keeping it maintained, for keeping it drained, and for the investment that's going to be needed. And I would say that everyone around this table is keen and willing to support the lobbying effort whenever it needs to be made.
Yeah, I would support that, Councillor Aston, and alongside that, government are very interested in food security. It's not just about the pound signs that are attached to it, but it's food security amongst the global market there as well. And it comes back to me, the point about reactive and proactive. That reactive is a challenge in itself. I showed you the timelines of flood events which have happened. They're becoming more and more frequent. That takes all of our resources away, and we are responding, being very reactive to fix a problem there and then before the next one happens. We have an opportunity here to be proactive and determine what we want and how we will manage it and plan it. Or we have the continuing spiral of reacting and responding to the weather events that we're getting. We are here to try to get on top of that, do it proactively. That's the ambition.
Can I just add, the way things are going, there'll all be solar farms. There won't be any farming, so wait and see.
it will still need draining, or I don't think solar panels and electricity mixes very well in a swamp
Well.
and a fenland. I don't have anybody else indicating to speak, so could I just say generally thank you, Andy, for taking the time to come and present this. If you'll be so kind as to let our Dem Services team have your slides, we can make sure they're circulated to not just members here, but members that weren't able to join us this evening. Because
We have an updated lead about to be published. That's brilliant.
Brilliant, thank you. Because again, I appreciate the Fens are a relatively small part of the greater geography of East Lindsey. For me and for Neil, they are the bits that's blue on that map. That's our ward. And fully appreciate, as I say, we're on the fringes of it a little bit, but a really important subject nonetheless. And thank you for taking the time to pick up on all of those points. We've just got one more item on the agenda, which is item 6, which is an update on section 106 caravan and health provision subsidy. And I understand Phil is going to look after this one in Greg's absence.
Yeah, it's only very short for information update. For those of you be aware in terms of scrutiny of asked questions around how the NHS requests contributions for healthcare facilities in East Lindsey in terms of that formula, and there's been a bit of backwards and forwards as to why that is the case. The simple thing to say is that it's the case because that's the way they put the numbers through their system. But the update is about a very specific question which has been asked about how caravan populations are being accounted for by NHS when formulating 106 requests. And the simple response that I have to give you this evening is directly from the Integrated Care Board, which is that it continues to review its approach to securing Section 106 funding to support caravan sites. Key consideration in the process is the distinction between sites that provide more permanent residential accommodation and those for short-term occupancy. And current evidence indicates that funding applications are typically made in relation to permanent residential sites, which you'd expect, but that they are keeping that process under review. And that's all there is to add to that, say in Greg's absence.
This has been going under review for about 18 years, ever since I've been on the council. When are they going to come up with an answer? When will they? 18 years, I think it's been under review.
I can't speak on behalf of them myself. As local planning authority, we obviously take into account a whole wider range of requests for Section 106 contributions. At the end of the day, as long as they're justified, that's what meets the statutory tests. But yeah, I can understand the frustration, but we can only but ask the question.
Could we go as far as to extend to them an invitation to come and talk to us?
We absolutely could do.
Then everybody has the opportunity to ask. Go on.
Is it possible to find out what the actual drain on the NHS in these areas is? Because I understand, I'll give you an example. In Rugby, when I became a district councillor, everybody said to me, oh, there's no space in our Rugby surgery, nobody gets any appointments, blah, blah, blah. So I had an appointment with the person who runs the surgery and I said, what's going on? Why are we not getting? And he said, we have no such problem. We always have free appointments. Multiple people don't show up on their appointments. And so we have additional appointments. He said, we have no problem with our appointment system at all. He said, if we did, we'll go knocking, with LCC and say, well, we'd like some money. And he said, we don't need any money because we are absolutely fine. So I know that there's this general consensus in Rugby, there are no appointments in the surgery, and that is not true. And that's why I wanted to know, do we have any numbers from the NHS to say, actually, yes, of course, in the summer, they may have, 30 random tourists who've shown up who are out of the area and have, created a little bit more urgency in these care areas. But do we actually have numbers?
No, obviously not as we sit here now, no. In terms of, it's very much, in my experience, certainly when it comes to planning applications, that it's broadly very reactive. So you will get a request for a Section 106 contribution. I've had it a number of times over the years when I've sat in front of a planning committee and been asked, why has so-and-so not asked for a contribution? I can only but ask them and consult them. If they don't ask, then clearly their evidence shows that there's not a requirement in that area. And again, just to kind of rehash what I said a bit earlier as well, is the theory behind strategic planning is this kind of infrastructure will be picked up more broadly at that spatial strategic level in terms of infrastructure planning and funding. But again, devil's in the detail over the next few months as we see more policy and legislation emerge.
Splendid. Thank you very much. I don't see anybody else coming in on that, but we can all get an invitation off and see if they'd like to come and talk to us. And then, Councillor Aldridge, you can ask the relevant question to the relevant people.
Well, can I just say, ask the people down in Skegness, where they have major problems with all the caravan people that come in. The medical services down in the Skegness area are overstretched and locals can't get appointments.
Splendid. Thank you. I don't disagree, but obviously we can't speak for the people that are making those decisions. So we need, I think, to get them here and ask and put it to them. Alternatively, if someone would like to do a scrutiny panel on it, it might make for an interesting topic. Final item, date of the next meeting is 20th of November. So I shall bid you all a fond good evening and look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.